to welcome you all to Central Lutheran Church on this evening of a special presentation by Kate Gould. We at Central Lutheran have an organization called Lutherans for Justice in the Holy Land, and one of the things we did this year as beginning of the year when the drums were beating for wars, we all got together, decided we've got to lobby our Congress people. And we knew when we went, there has to be a better way. We need some skills, some more skills here. So anyways, one of our group has been talking, two of our groups have been talking with Kate. So Kate Gould is a legislative associate for Middle East policy with the Quakers, the Friends Committee on National Legislation, which is a lobby for the public interest, fielding the largest team of registered peace lobbyists instead of war and arms lobbyists in Washington. She's one of only a handful of registered lobbyists working to prevent war with Iran, and also lobbies for Israeli-Palestinian peace. Kate's also a board member for Churches Middle East Peace and is a contributor of Foreign Policy in Focus. And she also, her work has appeared with Huffington Post, PBS Frontline, The Hill, Truth Out, Common Dreams, and many others. So, Kate, thank you so much for joining us. We very much look forward to you.
Great. Well, thank you all so much for being here on this gorgeous day. I really appreciate it. And as many of you know, I'm actually from Ashland, but this is my first time being back home in Oregon since I started leading FCNL's work lobbying on Middle East policy in Washington, D.C. So it's great to be back, and we've made Oregon really a focus of ours and our overall legislative strategy on trying to prevent war with Iran. Oregon's definitely has Oregonians have a special role to play in all this because of the unique position that many members of Congress in the Oregon delegation are in. So I'll talk more about that later, but it's great to be here, and Portland is my favorite city on earth, I should say. It's wonderful to be with you all, and I want to particularly thank the Central Lutheran Church for having us in this lovely space. And thanks to all the organizations co-sponsoring this event, to Lutherans for Peace and Justice in the Holy Land, Portland. I know there are different people here. You could wave. Jennifer's in the back. And then also there is Oregon Physicians for Social Responsibility, which has co-sponsored this event, and Kelly's in the back. And actually, and Kelly, I know, were you going to... If you don't need to, okay, that's well. If you're interested in PSR, you can learn more afterwards, and also there's a bunch of great materials in the back. And the American-Iranian Friendship Council. I don't know if anyone is here. Okay, great. Yes, from the American-Iranian Friendship Council. So it's been great getting to know folks from all of your organizations and to hear about the great work that you're doing. So I thought I would, with the time that we have here tonight, go through debunking some of the most pervasive myths about Iran and about U.S. policy toward Iran. Of course, just as the non-existent attack in the Gulf of Tonkin incident was a pretext for the war in Vietnam, and just as Iraq's non-existent weapons of mass destruction was used as a pretext for the war in Iraq, there are many myths about Iran that have really controlled the discourse and have been very dangerous in ramping up the rhetoric and ramping up tensions for war. So I thought we could go through some of those, and then I will leave plenty of time for questions and answers at the end. And I very much look forward to your questions, taking your questions then, and of course, plenty of time for cookies and juice in the back if you didn't get some already, and also to look over the material in the back, lots of material from FCNL and also PSR, and maybe some other groups have put information out there as well. So I thought, I'd start off with a few myths about Iran. By the way, I've gotten some questions about this photo, so for those who can't see it, it's a picture of Iranian women. These are actually in Iran, in Yazd, Iran, and they're wearing Wars Map the Answer pins, the same pin that I'm wearing here. This was taken by a supporter of ours who was on a delegation to Iran. these are a few myths spreading Iran war fever. We have the myth that U.S.-Iran policy doesn't affect every American. It most certainly does. That Iran has nuclear weapons of mass destruction. That a military strike would stop Iran's nuclear program. And that negotiations with Iran, they've been tried, they've failed, and that a diplomatic resolution is impossible. Now, even there are many who, understand that U.S.-Iran policy does affect their lives, and that Iran does not have nuclear weapons. There is still time to prevent a nuclear-armed Iran and to prevent a devastating war. And that they understand that a military strike would be the worst idea as far as dealing with this crisis, but they still think that there's nothing they can do about it. So I'm going to go through and aim to persuade you all that all of these myths are completely bogus. So the first, so these are wrong, and you don't just take my word for it. Of course, these are just a sampling of some of the U.S. and Israeli military officials who have also made the case that a military strike on Iran would be disastrous, and that diplomacy is the best way to prevent war and a nuclear-armed Iran. And then that's just a cool picture from Tel Aviv, Israelis demonstrating in the streets of Tel Aviv against war with Iran and in support of diplomacy. So there's first about how U.S.-Iran policy affects you. So of course, there's the human cost of war, which is incalculable. The financial cost of war is hard to calculate, but there have been a panel of academics, of experts well-versed in war accounting that have determined that the total price tag of the wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Pakistan is estimated to be about $5 trillion. To put that in perspective, that breaks down to about $16,000 per person, per U.S. taxpayer. And yeah, it gives you just a sense of what kinds of costs there are involved. Of course, so many experts have estimated that a war with Iran would make these would pale in comparison, to these kinds of costs. Then there's the cost of the status quo with Iran. So even if we don't see a devastating war, there is a real cost, a financial cost, to maintaining the status quo U.S. policy toward Iran. I think, I'm sure many people in this room, are very concerned about U.S. sanctions against Iran and the kinds of suffering that they have caused in Iran. We've seen in the case of Iraq that U.S. and UN sanctions against Iraq contributed to the deaths of 500,000 children. That's an estimate from UNICEF, the UN's Children's Fund. But in Iran, fortunately, we're not at that point yet, though with the current trajectory of U.S. policy, we could very well see that down the line, unless things change. I know, though, that as far as talking to the broader public, talking to people that we all talk to every day who aren't so interested in what's going on in Iran and are interested in what's going on here, I think one statistic that really makes it all a lot more tangible for people is that of the average $4 per gallon gas that we're at right now in this country, 25 cents of that is estimated to be the cost of the U.S. sanctions against Iran. So the cost of U.S. sanctions against Iran are paid by all of you to the tune of 25 cents of every $4 gallon of gas. And again, to put that in perspective, that the federal taxes that we pay on gas go to 18.4 cents a gallon. And that's unchanged by gas prices or inflation. The cost of U.S. sanctions against Iran and those kinds of impacts do change by gas prices and inflation. But right now we're seeing that you're actually spending more on, as a result of U.S. sanctions against Iran than you are contributing to federal income. I mean, they're contributing to federal taxes from your $4 gallon of gas. So pretty striking. So despite what we all hear from the media and from many politicians, according to U.S. and Israeli officials who know what they're talking about, Iran is not building nuclear weapons. So this is according to the White House, the Pentagon, U.S. intelligence, Israeli intelligence, and many leaders of the Israeli military and the International Atomic Energy Agency, the UN's nuclear watchdog. All of these sources agree that Iran does not have a nuclear weapon. Iran is not building a nuclear weapon, so Iran does not have a nuclear weapons program. This is, of course, often misstated. There's a lot of misinformation from the media and from politicians, everyone from Representative Michelle Bachmann to the current senatorial candidate in Massachusetts, Elizabeth Warren, has claimed that Iran has a nuclear weapons program without any kinds of substantiation of that claim. And on the other side, you have U.S. and Israeli military and the intelligence establishment coming to the conclusion. So this is all of the U.S. intelligence agencies have come to the conclusion that Iran does not have a nuclear weapons program now. And most importantly, that Iran has not made the decision about whether or not to build a nuclear weapon. So that decision has not been made. There is obviously still time for diplomacy to prevent ever seeing a nuclear-armed Iran and to prevent war. There's a lot of misinformation in the media, of course, but there was a great article from Reuters in March that I think summed it up really well, and saying that the United States, European allies, and even Israel generally agree on three things about Iran's nuclear program. Tehran does not have a bomb, has not decided to build one, and is probably years away from having a deliverable nuclear warhead. So that remains true to this day. So one might ask, okay, so then what's the big deal? Why are there all these concerns? And very grave, legitimate concerns about Iran's nuclear program. Well, according to U.S. and Israeli intelligence estimates, Iran did have a secret nuclear weapons program in the past. They never had nuclear weapons, but according to U.S. and Israeli intelligence, they used to. They were building one at one point, and they stopped that program in 2003. So there is an urgency to press for diplomacy in order to prevent war and a nuclear-armed Iran. Now, we have a list of quotes. Here, let me, 1 second. We have a list of various U.S. and Israeli intelligence officials warning against an attack on Iran. In the back, you can pick up this flyer that we have with just a sampling of those quotes from U.S. and Israeli intelligence officials saying no to war with Iran, and national security experts who have spoken out for the need for diplomacy with Iran. And also some information about legislation that we are advocating right now and that we are urging members of Congress to support that would go further in advancing diplomacy with Iran. Okay, so one of the many military officials, former military officials, who have spoken out against war with Iran is Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson. He is the former chief of staff for Secretary of State Colin Powell. So, of course, he was one of those who got us into the war in Iraq. He was actually in charge of preparing the so-called intelligence that was used for Colin Powell's speech at the United Nations, with the baby powder and test tubes and the whole 9 yards about the case for war with Iraq. And he has really come full circle. He has become a staunch opponent of war against Iran, also supportive of ending the war in Afghanistan, is against torture and closing Guantanamo, spoken out on a lot of issues recently, and so we've taken him on a number of lobby visits to meet with members of Congress and their staff. This is a picture of myself and then Representative Garamendi from California. So talking about the need for diplomacy with Iran. And he has this great quote. After we did this marathon of lobby visits for a week, he had this great quote in Vanity Fair where he was interviewed, and he said that inside the Pentagon, civilian and military, I cannot find a single voice in favor of striking Iran. Not only will we be mired in yet another interminable war, but from this one we might not recover for half a century. He has also spoken out specifically about diplomacy, and an interesting perspective that he brings is that he was one of just a handful of officials in the Bush administration who actually saw a proposal from Iran for negotiations. This was called the Grand Bargain in 2003, when Iran wanted to negotiate with the U.S. This was May 2003, and they laid out a full proposal of what those negotiations might look like. This was just to lay the framework for eventual negotiations, and they pointed out that the U.S. wants Iran to agree to all kinds of intrusive inspections on its nuclear program, and the U.S. would like Iran to stop arming Hamas and Hezbollah, and then Iran would like this siege of sanctions that's imposed upon it to be lifted, and a number of other things. It really does a good job of laying out what the other side wants from one another, and they did this as a goodwill gesture, of course, to try to get talks going. And unfortunately, it was just rebuffed straight out by the Bush administration. Vice President Dick Cheney said, "We don't speak to evil," and it was just dead in the water immediately. So even though there were some remarkable assertions in there, remarkable offers in there, we saw Iran actually talk about disarming Hamas and Hezbollah and joining the Arab League, endorsing the Arab League's two-state solution proposal that if Israel were to withdraw from the West Bank, then Iran would pursue normalized diplomatic relations with Israel. It shows that there was real possibility for dialogue that was rebuffed. Now, Iran, on the other hand, has also rebuffed opportunities for dialogue as well, and there's been this history of missed opportunities. So both sides have missed opportunities. The good news is that both sides, the U.S. and Iran, have actually agreed to far-reaching concessions to go forward with, to ease tensions between the two countries. So both countries have shown great interest in dialogue at some point. Unfortunately, they haven't been at the same time. So when the U.S. has been ready, Iran hasn't been ready, and vice versa. But there's a new opportunity coming up in about a week. On June 18th and 19th, the U.S. and 5 other world powers will meet in Moscow with Iran to address its nuclear program. And hopefully not just to address Iran's nuclear program, but to address the concessions that the U.S. and the other world powers are willing to offer. And really what that comes down to is, while all the rational actors on all sides understand that Iran will eventually need to agree to different kinds of, to more inspections, more comprehensive inspections of its nuclear program, to certain ways of limiting its nuclear enrichment program. The U.S. and the other world powers also need to make real concessions. And in the last round of talks, we didn't see that. We didn't see any sanctions relief offered. And so it begs the question, well, what's in it for Iran to go through with all these far-reaching concessions and really open up their nuclear program even more to the international community when instead of receiving sanctions relief, they have been hit by computer viruses that have destroyed, by nuclear assassinations of their nuclear scientists, all those things. So it's actually empowering. These kinds of militaristic policies have empowered hardliners in Iran and have disempowered those who actually want to see a deal, and those who want to see a deal on all sides. And of course, we don't know what will happen if there's really a serious deal, if there's really a serious proposal for lifting sanctions against Iran. Will Iran agree? That is yet to be seen because that's yet to be offered. But that's definitely a first step. And I can talk more about the ins and outs of these negotiations, but I think the basic principle is that for finding a resolution is that Iran would need to agree on taking different steps for more transparency of its nuclear program in exchange for what is called sanctions relief, lifting some of the sanctions against Iran, and of course, reducing the threats. Both sides need to reduce all the heated rhetoric. So, finally, on how you can prevent war with Iran. Again, I mentioned that Oregonians have a special role to play because of the Oregon delegation, because of the members of Congress that represent Oregon. So there's Senator Jeff Merkley. He has a particularly important role to play because he's on the Senate Banking Committee, which it doesn't sound like it has anything to do with Iran, but actually that committee is in charge of putting together the sanctions packages on Iran. So they're in charge of a lot of legislation going through on Iran. And then Senator Ron Wyden is on the Senate Select Intelligence Committee. So, of course, that is also extremely influential in advancing U.S. policy goals toward Iran. Interestingly, the chair of the Senate Select Intelligence Committee is Dianne Feinstein, and she has been the single champion. She's known as not often speaking out against war and other wars, but in this case, she has actually been the single champion for diplomacy with Iran. She has been very vocal, published a lot, she's published a lot of brilliant op-eds. So we hope that the Senators Wyden and Senator Merkley will follow her lead in speaking out against these aggressive tactics and in support of diplomacy. And then there's Representative Blumenauer, and he has been the greatest champion, or one of the greatest champions for diplomacy with Iran in the House. So while Senator Feinstein is really taking the lead in the Senate, it's Representative Earl Blumenauer who's really done some phenomenal speeches on the House floor. That have brought me to tears, and they're just really, really astounding speeches against war. And he, of course, on a number of different issues, but he has been a real champion on Iran. And I know that, of course, that's because, in large part, because he's able to do that with his constituency, with representing Portland, and the good people like you who make that all possible to speak out like that. And so I hope that Representative Bonamici will also follow in his footsteps on that issue. She, of course, is pretty new, and she hasn't had much time to really stake out a position on Iran. But there was an important vote recently, and we have some more. If you want more information about votes and how the members of Congress in Oregon have voted on different bills and such, we have more information on the back. But one example of that is that we have been working very hard on supporting bipartisan legislation from Representative Barbara Lee in California and Walter Jones in North Carolina, and Republican in North Carolina and Democrat from California. They have put forward legislation that would actually lift the no-contact policy. So there's this policy that's been in place for years and years where U.S. diplomats cannot speak to Iranian diplomats. So, I mean, that means they can't say hello, they can't resolve if an American's imprisoned in Iran and they want to immediately, and they see this Iranian official at a UN meeting and they want to immediately try to resolve the situation, they have to get advance permission from Secretary of State Clinton, in this case, to be able to talk to Iranians. So this legislation would lift that ban. It would prohibit any kind of preemptive attack against Iran without congressional authorization, and it would just generally support diplomacy. And so there was a vote on that. Blumenauer did vote for it. Bonamici voted against it, unfortunately. But 77 members of Congress voted for it, and so the legislation failed. But we now have 77 members of Congress on the record in support of diplomacy. It's supportive of, I mean, almost, going so far as in support of FCNL's position. I mean, that's definitely unprecedented that we have so many members of Congress on the record on that, and we hope to, of course, grow those numbers. And considering where we were actually at the beginning of my job, where we just really had like 5 members of Congress speak out about this stuff, and it was Blumenauer and Dennis Kucinich and Ron Paul, and now we're up to 77. It's certainly a positive shift in the right direction. So these are just a few simple steps that you can take to help prevent war with Iran. A lot of the most effective action, timing is a big factor in that, in terms of when it's most important to call, to make phone calls, to write emails. And so, and things change, of course, with Congress constantly. And it's my job, it's our job, to keep up with that and to let all of you know about that. So I would encourage you to sign up for our email list. I know it's going around. And you can also, there's another sign-up sheet in the back. And then you can keep updated about when the most important times are to really weigh in. And then another thing you can do all through this, especially through this campaign season, is to go to town halls and go to candidate forums and ask questions. Ask questions about Iran, ask other kinds of policy questions. If you have trouble figuring out what you want to ask to really both make your point and also make it a good question that will facilitate a response that will give you a good indication of where the member of Congress stands for other candidate, then you can check out, we have a newsletter in the back called Questions for Candidates, and we have a host of different questions on all the issues we work on, Native American rights and immigration reform, and on Iran. And then you can also find more at fcnl.org/QFC, that's Questions for Candidates. And then, of course, you can write a letter to the editor. They, only 100 words, 150 words, and you get it in your local paper, and that's the letter to the editor section is often the most frequently read section of the newspaper. It's not just read by the public, but also by members of Congress, and I've seen that happen firsthand, certainly, and also it's important to note that these days all congressional staff, they set a Google News alert, so they set it to the member of Congress's name. So then when you include member of Congress's name in your letter to the editor, it pops up, just as it would pop up in the New York Times, it pops up in the Oregonian or whatever. So it's a good way to immediately you can speak to to folks in your community at the same time as you're speaking to members of Congress. And then I think you can really go the extra mile by not just mentioning your member of Congress's name, but also including a specific request about that they should co-sponsor this legislation, or that they should speak out against war, or tie it with something with some kind of request. And as always, with all this stuff, if you need any guidance on that, I'm always happy to help. We've published in the last month or so, we've done about 25 letters to the editor in local papers around the country, trying to get support for this legislation, which then, the pro-diplomacy legislation, which 77 members of Congress have supported. And then, best of all, you can, and most importantly, you can actually lobby for diplomacy. So that means it's just to visit your congressional office, and you don't have to go to D.C. You can do it right here. In fact, much of the most important work happens right here, in the states, in the districts, in Portland, and you can meet with your congressional offices. I'm sure many folks in this audience have. But you can, if you haven't done it before, it just takes getting together a group of, it's great to get together a group of about 5 people and set up a meeting, ideally with a member of Congress. There should be actually a lot of opportunities for that coming up, because, so now we're in June, they're going to be home for the July 4th recess. Members of Congress will also be home for most all of August. And then with the campaign cycle, they're hardly going to be in Congress at all. They're hardly going to be in D.C. They're going to be out here. They're going to be all over the country. But it's a great, this whole period coming up is a great time to meet up with them. And, you get 30 minutes or so to figure out how you're going to divide up your talking points with the group. And And we can provide a lot more guidance. We have flyers over there about just basic tips for lobbying, and of course can always provide more customized guidance for you all. And then another fun way to do these lobby visits is to actually, when you're working on Iran, and I would encourage for these lobby visits to really pick one issue, one, maybe two, but especially for the visits in your home state. If you're in DC, constituents, they get a little more, they get a break, and you can bring up, a couple issues because that's your one time in DC. But for your Oregon visits, I would really encourage you to just stick to one issue. And I know that's hard, but I hope that folks will be interested in lobbying on Iran specifically. And one, a great way to prepare for that and to also organize people for that lobby visit is you can order these postcards, Diplomacy Not War with Iran postcards. And we have many in the back, and actually it'd be great if you could sign one before you leave today. You can just put your address there and address it to either Senator Markley or Wyden, or we'll do that for you. And just making the point that it has Admiral Mullen speaking out about how it's crazy that we had a better connection with the Soviet Union than we did during the Cold War than we do now with Iran. So he has a great quote on that, and again, the Iranian women with the war is not the answer pins. And it's a great way to bring a stack of these postcards and actually deliver them directly, rather than just through the mail one by one, but to collect them and deliver en masse. We ask that people actually give them back to us, and we'll do the lobby visits, or that people use these for their own lobby visits in your own communities. So those are some, and then of course we also have flyers. We have lots of other materials you can order for your organizing work. And then whenever, of course, you are in DC and would like to lobby there, then we're always there to help you out. We have a major lobby day coming up in November, and I have on November 15th through 16th in DC, big lobby training for us, and we'll get hopefully a couple hundred folks out there lobbying for peace. So you can take one of these flyers if you're interested, and then also sign up. You can sign up for the lobby visit in December that I will be organizing. So here in Portland, if you're not able to get to DC. So those are, I think that's it. And so look forward to being in touch. Thank you so much for coming out. Really appreciate it. Thank you.